Hello, everyone, and welcome to another CANNAtalk session. I would like to take this opportunity to thank Canna for organizing these events and being leaders in educating, supporting, and developing our industry. Today, we're going to talk about the state of the cannabis industry in Europe and its impacts on Canada. I'd like to remind everybody that this is an interactive session, and we encourage listeners to submit questions that we will take as the session is ongoing. You should see a little QA box just below your screen where you can punch in your question. So today, Europe's cannabis market is rapidly evolving, with Portugal, Germany, and the UK driving regulatory and supply changes that will reshape global pricing and access. While Canada benefits from Europe's current reliance on imports, rising domestic production and stricter rules will intensify competition. Canadian firms must act now, leveraging innovation, partnerships, and differentiation to secure long-term leadership. Here are our panelists today. We have Sherry Boudram. She's the CEO of CanDelta. They are former government employees and PhDs that focus on regulatory, licensing, and compliance in emerging industries. We then have Tom Martinson, commercial manager at Atlantic Cultivation Limited. Atlantic Cultivation was founded by a team of experienced Newfoundland and Labrador entrepreneurs committed to producing extraordinary and carefully crafted cannabis. And last but not least, we have Stefan McDonald. He's the CEO at Lot 420. Locally rooted and globally recognized, their flowers are domestically and internationally celebrated. Let's start by setting the scene of this conversation a little bit. And Sherry, I'd like to start with you. Let's start with the big picture. What are the most significant regulatory developments happening right now in Portugal, Germany, and the UK? I know there's been a lot of things happening, and if you could kind of set the stage on what's happening currently, and if you have some new news for us, that'd be great.
Great. Yeah. Thanks, Nico. And thanks for having me here. I mean, great start. As you can imagine, the international markets continue to evolve and will continue really to do so in the next 5 to 10 years. And, maybe even beyond that as more countries begin to develop legal frameworks. But really to provide some foundation on some of the key markets, I guess to begin with Germany. Germany enacted the Cannabis Act, or CanG, last year. So that was, a great development, removing cannabis from the Narcotics Act, and then really creating a regime where there's a Consumer Cannabis Act, so the KCANG, which is really a non-medical use, still quite limited, but still an avenue for non-medical, and then the Medical Cannabis Act, or the MedCanG, for medical and scientific supply. So this materially reduces the prescribing and handling frictions that you were seeing for medical cannabis, and reframe the licensing under B Farm. So no longer, via that old tender mechanism that you were seeing before, allowing a different pathway for access. And physicians no longer requiring narcotic prescriptions for most cannabis medicines, but dispensing does still remain, largely pharmacy-based. There is also the cannabis social clubs, which you've been seeing, which is under the non-medical use framework, and that became permissible last year, in the summer of last year. There's still very strict rules on that, so it's not as open, free market as people were initially envisioning. It is very limited to the members of that social club, and the commercial retail remains prohibited pending pilot projects. So still limited for that, the social club aspect of it. And then Germany having the Pillar 2 now coming out with the pilot projects, where there's regional time limited retail trials. So they're really looking at how to frame that retail market, and starting with a pilot project that is fairly limited, that is being approved at the state level, and then looking at it from the federal lens as well. And right now, in Germany, they don't have a fully federally sanctioned pilot with sales really happening widely at this point, but we do expect it the ending of this year to early 2026. We're actually working with one client who did get approval from the state ministry for 2 retail stores in that state. So very excited to see that happening and that there's motion on that, and expecting to see the rollout of that happening eminently. We are also seeing increase of telemedicine in Germany as well. So there is that caution that we're kind of seeing a little bit in the market where we're seeing imports still coming in, of course, but there is going to be more competition happening and price compression as the market begins to shift with the imports, and eventually as you see domestic capacity eventually increasing. Portugal is interesting. Portugal, as we know, is medical, with Infarmed overseeing that mature market. There has been some political volatility that has slowed the adult use initiatives in Portugal, but medical cultivation, manufacturing, exports, they've all expanded fairly rapidly, I would say, in positioning Portugal really as a leading EU production hub within Europe. They are issuing, they have issued licenses. There are companies that have attained EU GMP certifications, really like solidifying that intra-EU supply. But we have recently seen more tightening of the regulatory framework and Infarmed's enforcement. Back in May, you may know that the Portuguese police raided several licensed cannabis operators for alleged links to organized crime, which ultimately negatively impacted the international perception of the country's industry. So that situation eventually became more worse as some of those license holders, their licenses were actually pulled, either suspended or revoked in the weeks that followed that raid. And it's a variety of there's the reports saying that the companies thought that these were valid transactions, but there was some uncertainty on the certificates that they had, and the actual transaction, whether they were authorized or not. So Infarmed has increased the oversight, especially in the upfront end with the imports coming in. So there's a lot more paperwork on that end, reviewing certificates, authorization. So it's becoming a little bit more challenging to have outside sources of cannabis being imported into Portugal because of this more recent situation. So I guess moving on to the UK, the UK is a very promising market, I would say. It is lagging behind Australia and Germany in terms of its development, but it's still a very promising market. It does remain medical only and does rely heavily on imported products as well, having dispensing through the pharmacies and having products that are regulated through the MHRA. So having specific import guidance on that. And we have seen that the recent import guidance earlier this year, that's basically reiterating the licensing route for manufacturing and importing of these cannabis products into the market, and still, of course, intending it to be therapeutic use for those particular products. So, still a lot of movement in the markets. We've seen, still changes. It's still evolving. The regulators are looking to explore different avenues. Germany, especially, I think is still, quite a big leader on their rollout, and it's nice to see that they've had their pilot project actually moving, because it's been in the works for so long. So, a lot of movement there from the international markets.
Wow, thank you. That was a very good circle around of all that. Really appreciate
I could
that.
say more.
Oh, I bet. And I actually have a follow up that comes a little bit later. I wanted to talk about the GACP and how some people have gotten through around, but we'll get that a little bit later. So to keep setting up the scene. So Stefan, you participate in all those markets that Sherry's talking about, I believe. Yes. What have you seen? How's this affected the actual exports from Canada?
In particular to the Portugal situation, there's been some, which Sherry mentioned before, the raids have had a real impact on import and export permits. So it's the time frame to obtain those import and export permits has gotten a lot longer. Some companies, because what happens here is most of the product that goes to Germany is either sent to a third party prior to being sent to Germany. And that third party will do an EU GMP call it washing if you want, of the product, or packaging to be more correct. We'll call it packaging of the product, and they will then ship it to Germany. And a lot of that trajectory was going through Portugal. So what happened is like Sherry was mentioning about the raids. Well, they got really strict on giving out more import and export permits, and they made it a little bit more complicated because you now have to submit a COA to submit to submit for an export permit. So prior to that, you could have just submitted a bunch of export permits and kind of planned out your scheduling that way. You know what's coming up, and you've just got your permits in hand, right? Now you have to wait till the harvest is ready, finalized, then you give the COA, then you can go for an export permit. So that's made it even longer for people. And it's been complicated because, they're giving them out less. So what that's happened is you've got a glut now in Portugal. And I guess that would be now affecting the Canadian market because a lot of people have a backlog in what kind of product they can send. And if you don't have other routes, be it the UK or Australia or Israel, to kind of redirect your lots, well, then you might be stuck with some product and trying to get back onto the B2B in Canada, which I think is probably not the best time, considering, like we were talking about before, that we're heading into the outdoor season, heading into the final quarter for all the companies. So yeah, that's what I've been seeing so far.
Wow. And have you noticed a decrease in overall exports, like percentage wise, of product from your perspective?
I think so, because I've had a lot of people call me and try to sell me product because they said that they're no longer able to ship it through their current trajectory.
Okay.
So I would say yes. Yeah, definitely.
So I guess, Tom, I'm going to flip it right to you. This kind of segues to your question with what is all happening with the regulatory that Sherry mentioned, and how that market is happening, and Stefan getting some calls to try to move extra international material. How has this affected the Canadian supply? Are we seeing an oversupply? Are we seeing some desperation here? And just Stefan, to add a little bit, the outdoor is coming. That's always a little bit of a hit this time of year. So yeah, how has this affected the overall Canadian supply?
Yeah, well, like Stefan was saying, those extended timelines for Canadian export, coupled with the outdoor season and the end of the quarter for these pubcos, kind of created a perfect storm. It's a bottleneck domestically, so what's happening is inventories are starting to pile up, and producers who are counting on this outlet now need to figure out a way, who require this revenue. They basically need to figure out a way how to move it on the B2B market. And similar to Stefan, we're getting a lot more calls on, producers that don't have an outlet and are trying to move that within the domestic market. So it creates rapid compression. So we're seeing the price per gram drop significantly, particularly over like the last 6 to 8 weeks. Like flour that would have been $1.50, we're seeing as low as 75 cents. And as time goes on, the prices just like drop lower and lower, and then, like I said, with the upcoming outdoor season, you're starting to see some pretty competitive pricing be available on some of the older greenhouse products. So it's creating a lot of pressure, and it kind of exposes some of the weakness in like the Canadian operations. So if you become too dependent on those export channels and you're forced back into the domestic market in Canada, it really is tough, right? So you really need to have a kind of a sustainable model within Canada, within the B2B market, and on export as well. So
great point, Tom, to have a good business model. And to me, the good business model is, yeah, it's great to have the golden egg at the other end there and chase that big money. Great if you can, run to the bank every day if you can get that. But the entire business should be a little bit more conservative, in my opinion, and understand your costs, where the more let's call it shore market to move product is domestic. So in order to compete with this ebb and flows, it all comes down to cost of goods, right? Cost of goods produced. So Before we get into supply and pricing, I just want to reiterate to the audience that this is a live show and you can ask your questions. I will pose the questions right away. So please ask your questions if you have any questions for us, for the panelists specifically. So on supply and pricing, so Tom, you're talking about all this extra supply and what the cultivators are going through. How are the wholesale and retail cannabis pricing trending in Canada? You already said down to 75 cents. Is that all related to oversupply? Or are there other factors that drive that, like the shift in market segments? Are we not buying a $1.50 flower anymore because the actual consumer is not asking for that? So what is it? Is it a supply? Is it a retail? It's a combination. Love to get some notes on that.
It's definitely a combination of the two. I mean, what you're seeing is that whole flower is losing market share overall to convenience categories. So there's obviously pressure created by that. Consumer buying habits, everybody's going towards convenience. You're seeing infused pre-rolls and vapes. All those categories are gaining market share while slowly eroding whole flower share, right? So that obviously creates a constraint. But there still is, domestic oversupply. A lot of people were gearing up, counting on these markets, counting on these channels, and these extended times. They really do. It's created a bottleneck. So we're producing more cannabis again, and there's less and less market share available on the retail. So yeah, product that would typically be moved abroad is now being redirected to the Canadian market, and that adds the pressure, right? And boards continue to push down the MSRP. We're still seeing a lot of price compression on the flower on the retail side. It's most aggressive within the value segment. So it continues to, like, the market continues to be under pressure. Like, the reality is that success depends on a clear grasp of your cost of goods sold. I think that's something that we as an industry have struggled with, since the beginning and are still kind of working through. And then you also have to work with, not on theoretical margins, but what it takes to compete in Canadian retail today. Sometimes we all think that, what cannabis should be worth, but what it is actually worth given the current market conditions. And, don't get me wrong, I'd love to have premium flower be worth, $2.50, $3 all day long. I'd love to see that segment be greater than it is. And, if you look at more evolved markets in the US, I think we will trend and see that way. But you're also going to see more erosion of the dried flower category. We see that, in those more evolved markets. So eventually, I think you will see stabilization. But right now, we're still in that phase of compression. And, it can create a lot of challenges for producers. If you don't have your grow dialed in, we're seeing a lot of growers, starting to get that dialed in, which pushes up the quality of the cannabis, and your costs are going down. I know, for instance, like for us, we've seen a 22% increase in yields this year, which makes our flower significantly cheaper. So, there's still a lot of opportunities there, right?
And again, it comes to the cost of production, right? And understanding to not just go for the gold, but make sure that there's constant improvement. Like you said, you guys have been in operation for quite a while now, and again, an increase of 22%, right? And what does that do? It's not just more weed in your pocket. Sure, it is, but it's lowers your cost, right? And that's the whole thing that we've been driving with all these conversations we've had. Whatever topic it is, it always comes around of cost of operation, cost of production, so that you can stay viable and go through these challenges that we see. So Stefan, on the international side, I know that you don't deal necessarily with retail prices, but are we seeing the same retail trends over there? And is that affecting the wholesale prices as exporters? So are we seeing, it's much slower, like Sherry said earlier, so there's less of these vape products available, but is that catching on? And is this going to happen and do the same thing as we're seeing?
Yeah. So we actually do look a lot at retail, because one thing that we do when we sell our flowers in Europe, we don't wholesale the flower. We put it under our brand. So we do look at the retail price a lot. And it's been going down in Germany. It's been going down. We've been able to keep ours pretty well above average, just because we've put a lot of time and effort into doing a lot of events in Germany, a lot of B2C events. So just getting really close to the consumers there and the medical patients, and that's helped us. Also, we were probably one of the first movers to bring out our brand over there in Germany, so that helps. We now have a pretty good brand loyalty, but regardless, that only takes you so far. And we have seen a diminished volumes, but price kind of steady. But we have seen that in other segments and at other people who other companies, definitely a big price compression in Germany. I mean, you got to think, there's it's always the same, eh? It's the amount of patients versus the amount of products available, right? So like there's just been way too many products brought out in the last year in comparison to the amount of patients. There was at one point a really high rise in patients, high rise in products, and they were kind of going hand in hand, and it was sustaining itself, and it was keeping pricing up, keeping retail price up. But now I've seen a trend where there's a little bit less patients and way more products. Like the proportion of what's coming on, like there's just way too much products coming on than in comparison to the amount of patients hitting the market. So that's the trend I've seen in Germany right now. Yeah.
Very interesting. So the more people that play, yeah, of course, it's going to affect the velocity of individuals as a downfall. So
Correct.
One thing that was done, and I'm going to go to Sherry with this. One thing that was done for quite a while. I mean, I've been, in the regulatory and consulting for a bit, and done some GACP certifications, or not certification, but inspections and accreditations and things like that. And it was quite strict at the beginning. And then all of a sudden, it got opened up a little bit. So as long as you knew somebody with GACP, you could kind of just go through them and then land in Portugal. Is this still the case, Sherry? Or will, on top of the extra paperwork that you and Stefan mentioned already, will everybody actually need to go through the GACP? And what does that even look like? Because I tried to answer that question to many folks out there. Am I going to get a certificate? Am I going to get a stamp? Am I going to get a medal for something? So what does all this look like?
The
And
medal.
yeah,
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Yeah, I guess like the one thing that's worth mentioning is that, like, as a headline here is that the EU, specifically the European Medicines Agency, or EMA, that they've modernized GACP guidance recently for starting materials of herbal medicines, and they're essentially trying to tighten off the handoff from GACP to GMP. So practically, once you move beyond cultivation to primary processing, so drying, cutting, or grading, or even first packaging, you're likely now into GMP territory, depending how you define your product and that pathway, the product cycle, and having then tight QP oversight and Annex 7 expectations at the point. So that really means that, so for those who may not be familiar, the Annex 7 provides guidance on how GMP principles should be applied to the manufacture of herbal medicine products and herbal drug preparation. So it's meant to bridge the gap between GACP, which applies to raw herbal medicines, and then to the GMP. So if you're thinking about thinking of GACP covering, how you grow and harvest, and then GMP as you shape that material into something close to a medicinal starting material. So this interface has to be clarified, right? And that's like a very important distinction. And people have for a very long time tried to like blur the lines between that. And I think that's kind of where like the GMP washing comes around and all of that. So regulators are trying to make that more clear and more distinct. So it's like a very defined point. So the recent changes, the recent updates for the GACP guidance does also clarify issues associated with outdoor greenhouses, indoor cultivation, collection of medicinal plants, production facilities for primary processing of medicinal plants. So all of that's addressed for indoor grows as well. So regulators are now expecting engineered controlled air, climate, humidity, water treatment, and filtration. So just really like defining the critical process parameters and quality attributes that you can really see when you're reproducing the batch after batch. So, in other words, they just don't want indoor cultivation or cultivation to be a black box, but really make sure that it's clearly measured, recorded, calibrated, and controlled. So, where the operations fall under the scope of the guidance really depends, again, on the application of the finished medicinal product. So in general, the closer the preparation is to the final product, the stricter the requirements are. So for instance, if you have the requirements that are applicable to a herbal substance that's mechanically processed and sold as a herbal tea, for example, that should be at a higher point in terms of the requirements that are applicable compared to that of a herbal substance, which may be subject to further processing, because you're kind of like, if you're defining something like like a process. Foreign markets are starting to ramp up their domestic supply, and then they're eventually going to kind of say, do we need all that imported product? Like, maybe let's look at this a little bit more tighter, and then you see what's going on in Portugal as well. So I guess like the takeaway for importers, for exporters, is that you and importers, you really have to know exactly where that GMP and GACP and GMP process interface is, and really define that very clear in a robust, reproducible system, and really lock in the specifications and C of A's to the expectations of your buyer, right? So just having a very clear, clean dossier. So the opportunity is still there, but the bar has moved from GACP compliant to GACP plus approvable GMP release medicinal product with airtight documentation as you get through that point. So are people still GMP washing? Kind of like it is still happening. If they have a buyer that is confident in the product being accepted by their regulator, then yeah, we're still seeing that happening, for sure.
But
in terms of GACP yeah.
Sorry, just quickly on that. That's not like an illegal process to do that, right? Because in the end, as long as the producer is following the guidelines and the first buyer, the washer, has done their due diligence to do on the provider, that should be okay, correct? Because you still don't need a GACP certificate, right?
No, there is really no GACP certificate per se that's required, right? From a exporting global standard. Okay. There are some companies that will provide you with a certification. There are many companies that will do an audit and provide you with basically a compliance letter, signing off, we've done this audit, we've done a gap assessment, you've corrected it, and I've signed off on it, basically a letter of compliance. Right, and oftentimes that is sufficient for the buyer. Mm-hmm.
But the buyer still needs to dig into that. That one magic piece of paper does not just allow you to walk into Germany and say, "Hey, I can go."
And that's not exactly. And the buyer will still need to qualify you as a vendor, right? So you're still going to have to go through their QP process. A lot of times they still want to do an audit of your facility independently, anyways. So no, it's not like you just get this document and you should enter any market. No,
because EU GMP. Yeah, because on the flip side, EU GMP, there is an accreditation for EU GMP, correct?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay, so that's the big difference there. Yeah. Thank you very much for clarifying that. Moving on a little bit on brands and market opportunities. Go back to Tom for a minute here. To what extent is the consumer demand shaping product categories? So you've talked about how it's compressing and stuff. So such as the flowers, the edible, the extract. And is that really the main driver of the retail? I just want to drive this really hard, and for Canadians to hear this, is that what's driving the retail pricing? Should we be listening to the consumers and at the retailer level to plan our business?
Absolutely. I mean, I think one of the biggest challenges as, very passionate cannabis people that we are is, you come in and create products for yourself. But the reality is we're not the customer. The consumers will define what the market will look like. And, as in my previous role as a category manager with the province of New Brunswick, that was one of the challenges that I faced was, being ahead. I was looking for things that would draw me into the store, yet I still wouldn't shop at retail, right? So you really do have to meet the consumer where the market is, right? And that's what we're seeing is we're seeing that the whole flower sales are dropping. We're seeing those convenience categories take it over. And like you'll see the combined market share of pre-rolls and infuses actually overtaken dried flower. So, you're seeing more and more so more and more concentrates and infuse and things like that. And what we're actually seeing as well is on the B2B market, at least, trim values are going up significantly. Trim was 10 to 15 cents last year. Now we're seeing 22 cents, 24 cents, which is going to apply pressure to the concentrate market. Now, as we approach the outdoor season, it's going to come down a little bit. But yeah, there's more and more consumers that were never big into cannabis. They want cannabis that doesn't taste like cannabis, so they want bubblegum infused distillate pre-rolls. They want a vape that they can smoke and not have the smell on them. And I even fall victim to this myself. It's like as a parent. And like I'm very much a dried flower guy, or solventless, but sometimes it is easy to just rip a vape, if you're at an event, and it's just so convenient and kind of fits into the lifestyle, and that's what consumer buying habits are, and you really have to meet the consumer where they are, right? So
Big loaded question. Do you feel that most cultivators see that in Canada? Are they unaware or just hoping
I
that they
mean,
still are at the top? That's a
I
loaded
mean, and
question.
sometimes it's absolutely a loaded question. It's definitely going to vary because there are cultivators that are producing stuff for the heads. They're hitting the market. They're absolutely crushing in that category. Um, but yeah, it's something that we have to be mindful of when creating a product assortment is that you want to make sure that you have a broad assortment, that you're hitting the product categories that are selling well. I definitely think there's a lot of opportunity for approachable premium, as we kind of talked about a little earlier. We're seeing cultivators dial in their practices a little bit more. And the convenience, like I said, convenience across all categories, so you really need to be mindful of that within the retail space. And then another thing we see as well is that like at our retail stores, we're seeing a lot of people buying down lately. They have a constricted budget, so their kind of budgetary constraints are forcing them to buy down. So one strategy that we've taken within our retail chain is creating more upper core and premium options. So we're widening the assortment of the SKU breadth to hopefully get consumers into better cannabis, get them a better cannabis experience, right? Rather than just continuing to buy down into the value segment.
Very cool. Very cool. Stefan, so for Canadian companies, you mentioned earlier, and thank you for correcting me about retail and being direct to retail, because this goes very well with your next question. So for Canadian companies eyeing brand expansion, whether it's in Europe or Australia or whatnot, what lessons can they take from players such as you who've been around and have put a very significant presence in these markets?
Well, I'd say that's the main one, is a presence. It's you can bring your brand out, but if you're not going to be there to support it, you know, that's difficult. So you have to really, because usually, brands will focus. You might not get all your money up front. You might have to do some consignment to try to bring your brand out. So you're taking a little bit more of a risk there, but once you do bring the brand out, and once you do follow up with proper marketing, proper going to all the events, doing the being present everywhere. Once you do that, it'll help, because essentially what everyone does is usually just wholesales to other companies who build their brand off Canadian products, right? So, I mean, that's fine. Everyone has their own model, but we were able to kind of support ourselves and be able to bring out the brand and to really double down on it, so that, you know, when times like this happen, it's compression comes, you know, at least, you know, you're getting hit a little less. You still, everyone, no one can avoid it, but definitely if you have a brand, and just gives you more options too, you know what I mean? And it helps when you're when you're coming out to new countries. You know, Reddit's is a big thing. Everyone's on that. So like, you know, if you do well in one country and they know your brand, they'll follow up once you go out into the next country, and so forth. So to answer your question, it's you know, the biggest thing I would say is, if you're going to do the brand thing, you really got to like lock into it, because it might not be worth it if you're not following it up with what has to come with that. You know what I mean?
And what does that look like, Stefan? Do you travel a lot? Do you have somebody that's there, boots on the ground, like conferences?
Yeah, we do all those. Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, like really, like, you know, I started doing a lot of B2Bs when we were first trying to go out to Europe, and that kind of got me in my foot in with, you know, who are the players there, who are the business guys. But then afterwards, once we did bring the brand out, I've really focused on B2Cs. You know, we do, you know, this year I'm probably going to do 7-8 conferences throughout Europe, about where I'm going to have my booth. I'm going to have, it's the same thing as here in Canada. It's just it's so new there that it's the aura around it is way cooler. Let's put it that way. Like, you know, I think of Lyft back in 2017, let's say, you know, like, I go to events in Europe, you know, there's the biggest ones being Mary Jane's, obviously, is about 60,000 people. You know, that's insane, right? And then you look at other smaller events, their smaller events is like 3, 4, 5,000 people, which is a really good event in Canada at this point. You know what I mean? So there's still a lot of, you know, aura around cannabis there. Whereas here, I feel people have gotten used to weed, you know what I mean? And it's just like, it's not a cool thing that much anymore. You know, we've really lost the coolness to it. You know, like, my kid sees me smoking, he's like, you know, what, this is not cool. You know what I mean? So it's not like it was back in the days, but over there's a huge aura around it still. Like, I'm talking like, you know, just thousands and thousands of people showing up to these events, and it's cool, and you have to back it up. So you have to be at those events. And then, like you said, boots on the ground. You know, if you're in with pharmacies over there, help them out, send them some merch. It's basically the same thing as here in Canada, but you're trying to apply it in Europe.
But you have to do it. Yeah, you have to do it. You can't expect just it to work on its own, right? So thank you for that. Right. And just, you know, side note, I think you're a pretty cool dad. So don't take it to heart when you're kids. So Sherry, from a regulatory perspective, what do brands have to consider when they want to explore new markets? So not just going B2B, they want to bring a brand. They're very passionate about their product. And I know that the Canadian flag on brands does help to a certain extent in these international markets. So yeah, on the regulatory side, is it just as easy as Canada, or do we have other things that we need to look at?
Yeah, from the regulatory perspective, but also from the global marketing perspective, it's kind of hard to completely look at one and not the other. First, I like to tell companies, you know, you really have to be clear on and make that decision on the classification of the product itself in the market that you're entering. I mean, most of these markets are going to be medical, but maybe not, depending on where they're looking. You know, it could be, you know, actually considered maybe potentially a novel food. Could be a consumer product as things evolve. Like, it kind of you really have to hone in on that. And everything else kind of falls from that in terms of, you know, what you need from the regulatory perspective, who your regulator is, what licenses you need, how your product must be tested and labeled, how you could actually market it once it gets into that jurisdiction. And, you know, one thing that I think is some companies need to get used to, especially if it's not part of their portfolio and they're, you know, mainly like a rec brand, is, okay, now we want to go to Europe because everyone is going to Europe, or everyone is going to Australia, or wherever it may be. But we're known for this rec brand, but now we're going to have to add like a medicinal product, or have a medicinal spin on a product to enter a medical market. So I've worked with some companies where that shift kind of has to happen, and then there's a lot that needs to go into their actual marketing and branding and how they want to position their product and their company within that market as well. So I mean, once that's kind of decided, from there, really map out the quality standard chain of custody from end to end. So that's your GACP, GMP, GDP, and have a really clear understanding of what that really means in that market, so that the regulators, they do expect an unbroken line of control from cultivation or sourcing through to manufacturing, through to distribution, through to the pharmacy or retail release, whatever it may be in that jurisdiction, and then really define what that path is going to look like, and make sure that you have the dossier to be able to support that. So that's everything from your specifications, and we're seeing that it's not always one-to-one or as is in terms of the C of A's in Canada versus another market. We have to align with the local monographs and the expectations for those test parameters. So for example, in some countries they want you to notarate your product, right? Or maybe try some other method of decontamination. So understanding what that means and what that means for your product or your systems. And I guess in addition to that, once you're looking at the commercialization, like, don't ignore the boots on the ground, as you were talking about, and like that market access. What could you actually do? How do you actually bring that brand to the consumer and to the market? What can you do within the limits of the marketing and advertising? What is that going to mean in terms of your marketing strategy? We do a lot of work in New York. It's actually one of our biggest markets. As many know, cannabis is federally illegal in the U.S., but there are states where they've legalized and they have their own individual frameworks, which makes the U.S. extremely fragmented. But it is an exciting market in terms of population and just their overall culture. In New York, they have a branding license called a Type 3 processing license, and it's made specifically for brands. So you're not plant touching. You would have to work with a co-manufacturer, but it allows for the ability to bring your brand and partner with a cannabis manufacturer to bring your brand to market. So this license, which is a very great thing, is that the license can be held by someone who is not a U.S. resident. So the state regulator considers a citizen as foreign nationals from reciprocal treaty countries, as per or set out in their U.S. State Department framework. And Canada is one of those treaty countries. So by that definition, a Canadian can apply for this license. And we do have a client that was awarded a Type 3 license and now has commercialized their product in New York. So it is kind of cool to see a Canadian brand being commercialized in New York. So there is a pathway for it. And, maybe one day the federal legalization will happen, and then you can, freely kind of bring your products to the U.S. and export. But right now, this is, just kind of like a crack to allow for that.
Love to see lot 420 with a little Canadian flag jar sold in New York. Come on. Come on.
Yeah, we're going to have to talk, Sherry. We're going to have to talk.
Yeah, let's talk after.
Absolutely. That's what these talks are for. Again, telling the audience, if you guys have any questions, this is like a super interesting panel to me. These panelists are wonderful. The amount of information that we're getting is tremendous. So Sherry, just quickly, since you mentioned the U.S. and that's a kind of a potential new market or a way to get in there, beyond Europe, should Canadian companies keep an eye out on what countries? And let's not get into too far into U.S. politics, but quick, like maybe do you have an insight on that?
Yeah, I mean, like the U.S. Descheduling and federal legalization, I think that's still a while away. So I think that until maybe some more states come online, that it's not necessarily the forefront of their agenda. But it's still an exciting market, and I think that it's going to get there. And once it does, it will probably most likely dwarf Canada and And I think a lot of European countries are also very interested in the US brand as a whole. So I think when that
Very
happens,
interesting.
that'll be very big news. I guess
Yeah.
other than the US, you know, France is still a market that everyone is looking at. They're set to, have their framework, on the go. There's been a lot of talks on, finalizing that pathway and getting that going. So we do have clients that are, and, you hear in the industry, France is still a country that people have their eyes on. France is actually like very active now, and that industry, and having conferences and trying to get the buzz going over there and the interest. Australia, I think, to me, is still a very viable, interesting market, and that people are still, have their eyes set on the Australian market. Thailand, we all heard about. They had their policy reversal towards recriminalization, which I never thought they would do, but so that's a little bit volatile there. But Poland is also another one that people are looking at. UK, I think we talked about most of the bigger markets that companies are looking at right now.
Very cool. Thank you. And thanks for kind of explaining a little bit the US too. We always just think about how they do it federally, but how it works state by state, it's kind of very interesting, and highlighting some of the opportunities for people that do want to dip their toes and be ready for when it does open up, if and when. I don't think it's a if, it's more of a matter of a when. But
I think so.
Stefan, oh, sorry, were you going to say something? No.
No, I was just going to say I think so. I think what would be very interesting to see is how they would plan to harmonize, because the frameworks they vary so much. There's some states where they have a lottery, it's capped, some are open market. They have so many different license types. That would be neat to see.
Yeah, it's going to be quite interesting because I've been following it for quite a while. So about similar as you, and yeah, that's as they keep going, it just keeps getting more complex. It seems instead of trying to kind of homogenize things. Stefan, on the consumer side, internationally, any new not just purchasing behaviors, but like new regulations? Is there, like, for example, gummies, are they going to start moving across? Are vapes moving across? Are we just talking dried flower? And what do you foresee in the next couple of years? Should people kind of start getting ready for alternative than just a dry flower?
Right. Yeah, it's a good question. Well, I'll talk about the main markets. Let's say Australia, Germany, and UK. Kind of that's we could put Israel in there, but I know. Yeah, we could put Israel in there as well. Let's say those main markets. Australia, they've already been taking in vapes and certain forms of extracts. I think they even have shatter in there. I think they have gummies as well. So there's routes to do that already for Australia. In terms of what the market share is, I couldn't tell you because I'm not privy to that. But it's fairly new. It's within the last year they've had these products come online. The UK is the same thing. UK takes on vapes. I've heard about gummies and hash possibly being something that'll come into that market as well. But they've had vapes for the past. Yeah, I mean, they've had it for probably about a year now, maybe even longer. It's just that there wasn't many companies selling. I think when it first started, there was only probably about 2-3 products. They might be up to 15, 20 now. And I don't think it's a big market share yet. I think these are things that happen over time, where people are still, like I said, it's so new there still. You got to think that this is like a market like the UK is 7 years behind us, probably 6-7 years easily, right? So like when we started there, everyone was all about dried flower, right? It's just how things evolve, right? So yes, they have vapes, but it's not a large market share. Like I know, certain companies who are selling them. I know the volumes they do, and it's not minimal, but it's much smaller than it would be in comparison to the dried flower. Germany is still a hard no. What we've seen in Germany recently is extracts being produced in Germany and sold to the German market. So no exports of extracts, but I've seen certain companies do their own extracts in Germany in their processing facilities with flower that came from Germany. So I'm talking more specifically about the producers in Germany. There's not many of them, but there are a couple, and some of them are very large. And they've been able to bring out some rosin SKUs. I think they're working on hash as well, but no pre-rolls yet, and no vapes yet. So nothing for that market. Israel, I've just recently heard that they've started doing some oils, some extracts, but nothing serious yet. So yeah, that's kind of on those main markets. That's kind of what I've been seeing.
And maybe this is more for Sherry. I've been asked a few times, capsules, suppositories, more on the medical controlled dosage. Is this a trend that we're seeing that should be explored that's interesting? Or is it just going to be the same as in Canada? Hey, we have these products. They sell, what they sell. Let's just be honest with that. I'd hate to, I'm not trying to say it's not a good product. It's just the consumers are just, it's more of a medical
Yeah.
thing.
Do you mean, I guess, like in Europe specifically?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean the challenging part in Europe in having the medical framework and the way that the actual supply chain is set up is that it's so dependent on the prescribers and the pharmacies dispensing it. So like you need that the supply is shaped by the prescribers and the pharmacists, right? And like what they're prescribing to people. So it's harder to say that like I'm just going to make these products. Like there are people who want to make, I don't know, like some edibles, right, and like ship it over to Europe. But if nobody is prescribing it and nobody's dispensing it, and some pharmacies they actually do like it's almost like they do processing, so they'll do like a finished form of or like a last step kind of like processing step.
Yes.
So if nobody's doing that, then like you don't have a buyer. Like no one is going. You don't have a consumer.
Yeah.
So it's hard to say that I'm just going to like make whatever and just be innovative when there's nobody receiving that product. So the like right now the way it's set up is that the prescribers and the physicians, prescribers as the physicians and the pharmacies are really the one that's shaping demand.
Yeah.
I mean,
So
of course, the consumers do to some extent, but you need someone to be able to actually dispense it and prescribe it.
And the person dispensing has to agree with your needs or what you're looking for too. Just because you're saying I want gummies, the prescriber is just going to say
they might not feel comfortable doing that. So there's a bit of a gatekeeping there, right?
Yeah, very, very interesting. So we may take a little bit longer to see some of these 2.0s and 3.0 products really affect the market in significant ways, but they are going to get there is what we're saying, right? So we only have about 4 or 5 minutes left. So if we prepare for the future, Sherry, what are the main hurdles international companies face when entering new markets, and how can they better prepare to overcome?
Right. Well, that was one of the things that we talked about, just the market access and the clinical gatekeepers, and not being able to be innovative on the outset. Regulatory heterogeneity, so just having requirements that are, they vary so much country by country, and if your plan is really to hit certain countries, or you're trying to see which one is the best to go to, you really need to have a solid foundation of the regulatory landscape and see where there is crossover to try to minimize the amount of resources that you need to put in those efforts. So that's a challenge for a lot of companies, just getting that like first activation energy and those resourcing up front.
Mm-hmm.
I would say also maybe the continuity of the supply, as countries begin to increase the amount of domestic cultivation and rely less on imports. That's going to change the way that Canadian companies consider the international markets. And then just like every just the way it's been for all these years, just getting used to, the fast moving landscape, regulatory changes, and just being like agile from a compliance perspective. So,
and a good resource for these regulatory uh, information and new countries to call you, right?
yeah. And I think also, I mean, but, you kind of got to do your research like anything else. It's like it's like when you're starting a business, right? You got to do your research, come up with a business plan, a business case, and it's the same for that. It's just another vertical of your business. And I like that Stefan mentioned that, like the importance of boots on the ground and talking to people and seeing what buyers want. Like so many people forget that step. Like you're just going to say, okay, I'm going to be like GMP or GACP certified, and then just like give this paper to somebody and they're going to accept it. Like that's not the case. It's like any business transaction or business deal you have, you need to make sure the relationship works, that everybody's on board, and that's useful for you. Because if you're going to invest in, building out your or changing your processes, in some cases building out your facility or improving your facility through renovations, and then producing product, you want to make sure that's going to be accepted. So you need to make sure that the partner that you're working with is on board with that and is supporting that transaction.
Very cool. Tom, if you have any advice for Canadian companies, what pricing trends and supply dynamics should they be looking for, prepare themselves for in the near future and long term? Nice big long
In the near
question, but we
term,
only have.
yeah, in the near term, definitely expect further price compression in pretty much all categories. Well, you're going to want to tighten up cost structures now to stay profitable at the Canadian price points. Long-term supply and demand will stabilize, but it's only the ones who build a cost-disciplined structure will be here when prices do stabilize. So while international markets are an opportunity, profitability at home is the foundation.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And it's always looking at you clean up house before you can go anywheres, right? Stefan, last but not least, Sherry mentioned a couple of new countries and that on the regulatory side. What's exciting? What new countries is exciting for you in the next, short and long term?
Yeah, there's a couple. I won't share all my secrets, but but I will say that Poland is definitely one that I would highly suggest someone look into. We've got our first products launching there within the next couple weeks. I'd say a month to the latest, and it's a very long one. It takes about a year, maybe even over a year, to get into that country, but it's a huge country. As of right now, price is still very high there, so it's good for anyone trying to enter and get some good margins. Yeah, I'd say that's the one to look at for anyone right now.
Thank you so much, folks. We are at time. I want to thank the panelists tremendously. What an amazing conversation we had. We're looking forward to our next CANNAtalk. We have them scheduled periodically. To stay up to date with the CANNAtalks, you should subscribe to canna.ca/CANNAtalk, or you can send an email to cannatalk@canna.ca. And you'll have all the information there for all the shows that we do. And it's very interactive. Thank you very much to the audience. The only question that we got today is not even a question. It just came in, and it's an anonymous thing. It says cost, cost, cost. So I think our message went through in a sense of what is happening in the industry with prices and supply and how important it is to clean up house. So thank you very much, everybody. This is it for our CANNAtalk. Until next time.